Welcome to another review with Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, head over to iTunes or to Google Play and give us a rating comment. In this episode, we're going to review Fate of Freeport. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Jason.
I'm Adam.
And I'm usually Dave from the Digital Soup Podcast.
A proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts
At GonnaGeek.com and get ready because geekiness begins in 3,
2,
1.
Welcome to another review with Just One More Fix. Today, we are going to review The Fate of Freeport Companion. So it's no secret that we are big fans of Fate. And if you don't know what Fate is, you can go back several reviews ago and check out our review of Fate. But the long and short of Fate is that it is a more narrative-focused, like, rules-light game. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm.
With
use high adaptability.
Yes, it's a universal system that will work for anything. It's where the aspect system largely got popular and kind of came from, where you have sentences that kind of define the character and you can use those to gain bonuses or benefits. It has fate points. If you've heard that term, that's where they came from as well. And there are two different versions. There's Fate Core, which is more skill focused, and then Fate Accelerated, which is essentially the same game. It just has approaches as opposed to skills, but functionally it works the exact same way.
So now this is a companion book. So does it require one of the core rule books in order to use?
So yes, it would require you to either have the Fate core book or the Fate Accelerated book. I would recommend the Fate core book because it talks about some of the concepts in Fate and how they work with aspects and all that kind of stuff. So if you're not familiar with it, I think it would be better. You would be better off to have the Fate core book, but you could do it with just the Fate Accelerated book. And as far as creating stunts and that kind of stuff, there are better. It goes into more detail in the Fate core book. So I would say that you would need the Fate core book to have a better understanding of how to make the game work more efficiently and in a cleaner way. But you could get by with just Fate Accelerated if you want to, because essentially the Fate of Freeport is Fate Accelerated, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. So that's a brief synopsis of what Fate is, and if you want more detail and you're not familiar with Fate, go back and check out our original review of just Fate Core, and we talk about that in much more detail. So Fate of Freeport, the Fate Companion, is produced by Evil Hat and Green Ronin, and it is the Fate conversion for the city of Freeport, which is Green Ronin's city that they have created and center a whole bunch of adventures in. So any of those adventures, if you already had those and you wanted to bring them into Fate, I don't think it would be too hard to do because most of the adventure stuff that's in there is going to be story focused, I think, and would transpose pretty easily. So
all that being said, if you're not at all familiar with the city of Freeport, it makes no difference. You can still get plenty of use out of this book.
True. And actually, we don't use it for Freeport, to be entirely fair. We use it for more of a Dungeons & Dragons style game. So nothing against Freeport. It's just we play in other worlds, and I like the way the mechanics of this work. So if you want it for Freeport, great. There's lots of resources for it in there. And if you want it just for a straight-up D&D game, then it works for that as well. So like I said, it's from Evil Hat and Green Ronin, and it's written by Brian Engard and Clark Valentine, and it is about 192 pages. It's a soft cover digest size book, I think is what we keep calling these, like a 6x9, I believe it is. And it's got a awesome piratey swashbuckly scene on the cover of it that's pretty awesome. And the inside of the book is just black and white text. It's got a decent paperweight quality, and there's lots of artwork in it. I'm not entirely certain if this artwork is reused from the other the other Freeport products, because I'm not very familiar with them, but there is lots of good artwork in it, and it's all in a similar style and thematically appropriate. And I enjoy it. They're like pencil sketches almost, but they're good. I'm like, you say pencil sketches, it sounds like
They're not a simple doodle.
right. Well, I mean, I don't want to sound like it cheapens the art or whatever, but they're nice.
I like pencil sketches.
And it suits the black and white medium very well. You know what I mean? All right, right on. So that is the physicality of the book. And, we've had this one for quite some time and the binding is still good. Let's see, when did this come out? I'm just kind of curious because I know it's been out for quite a while.
Do you have a rough estimate of how much this book will cost me?
I think it says $20, $20 US on the back of it. But it's been around for a while, so I'm not sure how difficult or easy it is to get hold of. But
Evil Hat has a pretty easy to navigate web page.
Yes,
and you can usually find pretty much all of their products there.
On there, yeah. And as well, it should be on Drive-Thru-RPG. So it's 2013 is when this came out. So 5 years ago now, because we're in 2018. Hooray! Right on. So that's the physical book and the layout of it. And I like it quite a bit. It works pretty well. All of it is pretty intuitive. Most of the rule stuff is, not even most, all of the rule stuff is in the very front of it. Then there's a middle section that is about characters and, the next section is monsters that exist in Freeport, and they are converted to the Fate system. And then after that comes NPCs that exist in the Fate world. And then finally, the last part of the book is there is an adventure in the book that takes place in Freeport. What are you looking for?
I was just looking to see if it was like tabbed or anything like that. And it's not, but there is a running head on each page that says which chapter it's a part of, and it's all labeled that way.
It's not quite tabbed in the way that a lot of the Fate books are, but that's one of the things
that's what I was looking at. It is indexed, though, which is nice.
Yeah. How we've already talked about Fate a little bit, so let's talk about how this game is different from regular Fate and things that it does to make Fate Freeport, essentially.
Okay. I have not read this book. However, I have played the game. And so the first thing that I instantly noticed is that as opposed to your regular skills pyramid that you see in the Fate core game, you have the core Dungeons and Dragons skills.
Right. So you have strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom, charisma.
And that right there sets the tone for something Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, so it runs, like I said, more along the lines of Fate or Freeport with the approaches. So whenever you're going to make a check, you would just roll whatever ability seems appropriate. So if you're trying to smash an orc's face in, you're going to roll strength. If you're trying to pick a lock, that's dex. And if you're trying to remember something or have a knowledge-based thing, that would be intelligence. And then wisdom would be for willpower stuff. On down the line, it's pretty self-explanatory.
The other thing that stands out is that in addition to physical stress and mental stress, you also have stats for corruption and insanity.
Right. So one of the features of this is it's not, Fate of Freeport isn't just a regular run-of-the-mill D&D world. There is corruption that you can get by being exposed to certain things and also by using corrupted magic. And then insanity is just madness. So good old-fashioned craziness.
I think the incorporation of those two things makes it something that's hackable to do sort of a dark heresy type setting as well.
Right.
You're losing some of the ballistic and weapon skills that you see with that, but if you wanted to run an ultra light rules version of that, I think you could do this with
I think it was easily adaptable, yeah.
Other than that, you've got your standard things that you see on any Fate character sheet, or your refresh, high concept, trouble, your other aspects, and consequences, of course. And stunts.
Right, yeah.
There are spells included as well. There's a system for that, for magic.
So there are classes in this, and it kind of goes into your high concept. So if you want to be a wizard, you would add that sorcerer's part of it to your high concept or to one of your aspects. So if I wanted to be an elven sorcerer, that might be just my high concept right there is elven sorcerer. And all of the races, classic D&D races, as well as a couple of the other ones. I believe the plain touched are in here and that kind of stuff.
Now, does this include some sort of alignment in your high concept as well? So you'd be like the lawful wizard or the evil wizard. In the case of Rasslin, the wizard of questionable morality.
Right. No, it doesn't include it in there that it's required, but I think if you wanted that to flavor your game, that your game master should just ask your players, can you define one of your aspects to include some piece of your alignment, whether that's law, chaos, good, or evil, or however you wanted to do that. But it does have all the classic fantasy races, so humans, dwarves, elves, half-elves.
Gnomes
are in there, orcs, halflings, goblins, plain touched, kobolds even, my favorite, and Azar, which are...
There's like an angel and demon sort of...
Yeah, that's what it is. There's sort of like an Ifrit kind of a genie hybrid genie thing that exists in there. And something that's interesting is each of the races, in order to get the cool things that come with races, you buy them as stunts, basically. So you can spend your stunts on those things, or you can choose not to, which is kind of an interesting way to go about things, I guess, in terms of making sure that humans have something that sets them apart from everything else, because humans are supposed to learn things faster and adapt faster.
Well, they kind of pick up that in D&D, the human gets extra skill points and no penalties for cross-classing and things like that.
Right.
And they tackle it in this system by giving them the standard 3 refresh, whereas if you take a race that comes with specialty stunts, then you only get the 2 refresh.
Right, because you're required to buy extra stunts, essentially.
So you have cooler abilities, but less versatility.
Right. In addition to the races, there are no classes, which is kind of a classic piece of Dungeons and Dragons and the fantasy gaming. But they do have spellcasting is kind of a class unto itself, I guess you might say, in that you have to have it in your high concept in order to use it. And one of the things I do like how they handle spellcasting in this is that you buy your spells as stunts, and then in order to cast them, you can choose to do it a couple different ways. One, you can take a level of mental stress, or you can spend a fate point, or you can use a boost, or you can create an advantage on your spellcasting aspect in one round and cast a spell in the next. So kind of like a prolonged casting thing.
I thought that was how it worked, but I didn't want to say for sure.
So I wanted to make sure, kind of had to take them in to double check there to look at it, because that's the one that doesn't get used the most often. Most times it's either the fate point or taking a level of stress, because it's the fastest. And the thing that's fun about it is, in terms of casting, is that since the stress goes away every scene, you sort of have this refreshing resource of ability to cast spells. Now, granted, your spell list is smaller because it's based off of stunts, but it changes the way the wizard works in a certain way and makes it a little more fun, I guess, in that you don't have to. When you're a lower level wizard, you're really stingy with your spells. Or at least I am. I've always been that way, because you only got a couple to burn. Whereas in this, you can continue to pay and pay and pay and pay.
But you only have so much mental stress to expend. And so, I mean, you've got, 3?
Generally, you start off with 2. If you're a wizard, you probably have a decent wisdom or something, or intelligence. So it's going to increase your mental stress pool. So you might have 3. Plus, if you wanted to push it, you could take it into the consequences. So in theory, in one scene, you could cast 6 spells. And that's without spending any fate points. So it's, there's a fair amount there.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more flexibility, I feel like, in going that way. And it works the same, I should mention, for clerics as well, because prayer, miracles, and I think healing are all different schools of magic that you have access to. So when you buy your stunts, you buy sort of like schools of magic, and that gives you so many skills or so many spells that you can cast. I really like the way they handle magic for this and Fate, and it's actually one of my favorite magic systems for Fate. It came out long before the Dresden Files or Dresden Accelerated did. And in terms of that style of world, I like that spell casting that exists in that world better. But if you're looking strictly for something more D&D flavored and less like a ritual magic or Mage the Awakening or Mage the Ascension style magic, this is the way to go.
But even this is amazingly rules light compared to that, because now you're just talking about, you bought this school, here's all the spells, you buy individual ones as stunts, you're not keeping track of, well, this is how many 3rd level spells I have today, this is how many 2nd level, this is how many 0 level, and I have to memorize these. And
it's more about what's in your spell book than it is anything. So you're almost in a way sort of like more of a sorcerer as opposed to a wizard, I guess, because you can cast those, well, essentially as many times as you have fate points and stress for.
All I know is it's much less exhausting.
Yeah, this is true. But I suppose if your game master wanted to stick more with that older classic D&D, that classic D&D style Vancian magic, then you would just have them spend them as slots or whatever and make them memorize, these are the ones you have for today, which is entirely doable if that's the route you want to go. So it is easily hackable that way. All right, so one of the other big system pieces of this is gear and equipment, which is a big piece of Dungeons and Dragons. How big is your sword? How heavy is your armor? And all that greatness, right?
Yeah, because we don't really care about the dungeons or the dragons. We care about the treasure.
Right, the fiddly bits we get for killing the Dungeons and Dragons, right? One of the complaints that I have heard about Fate is that it doesn't handle hardly any bonuses for equipment. So if you're shooting a gun, right, whether I have a giant sniper rifle or just a pistol. It's more about the narrative and how good my character is with firearms, as opposed to what it is that I'm actually shooting, right? Because most Fate games don't, they're not interested in the equipment piece of things, right? Well, one of the things that's interesting about Fate or Freeport is that they have gone away from that, and there are several different levels of equipment, both for armor and for weapons. So depending if you have like light, medium, or heavy armor, it gives you extra levels of, or extra, not levels, extra boosts to soak damage with that you can spend, and they're kind of an expendable resource. And while that doesn't seem much if you're not familiar with Fate, it actually amounts to quite a bit. And in addition to that, your weapons can give you bonuses as well. So there is a big gear component to it. It may not be quite as important as it is in D&D, but it is a much bigger piece of Fate or Freeport than any other game, any other regular Fate game, I guess you might say.
Right.
And magic items actually can be handled in a much cooler way, I think, because you could give them aspects that could be tapped once a day or whatever, however you wanted to work that, right? And I like the idea of magic items with aspects as opposed to just a boring +1, because I think it gives them more personality and a little more flavor to them instead of just, this is a +2 sword, here you go.
Well, but like in D&D, it reminds me of, so you have your, what are they called? Your high quality sort of
Mastercraft?
Mastercraft, yeah, that's, I'm sorry, it wasn't coming to me. You have your Mastercraft weapons, but then you have your special items that have an actual name. And
Right.
while the ability they give you may not be any greater than what you would get with just a Mastercraft bow, if it's the elven bow of marksmanship,
Right.
then it just is so much cooler than...
right.
So this kind of does that. You get to give them their own little sort of backstory with that.
Well, then it makes it easier to add to it too, because you're just adding an aspect to it. And something that's kind of interesting is that Fate, the system is pretty simple. So if it gives you an extra boost, no matter how that boost works, you know exactly what it's going to do. Whereas in D&D, if you start adding pluses and modifiers to things, there's a lot of system there, and that can change a lot of things very easily, that you may have kind of unintended consequences of breaking certain systems with it. Whereas with Fate, everything's pretty modular and pretty straightforward. So I think it's harder to do if you're familiar with it anyway. Another interesting thing that Fate or Freeport does is the way you track wealth. And in D&D, we're all very familiar with writing down how many coppers and silvers and gold pieces and all this kind of stuff. Whereas
Keeping a careful tally of party treasure versus our own personal treasure.
Right.
Fudging the numbers as often as possible.
The way Fate or Freeport handles it is that you get wealth aspects. So they are essentially a boost. It's just a one-time thing that you check off, and it allows you to spend or buy whatever it is that you want within reason and sort of game master approval. But it sure beats counting individual gold pieces, because that does get very tedious and old. And as time has gone by, I just enjoy that less and less. So it is nice to just have, if you're going to go loot this dungeon, when you're done and you've finished everything off, you've got a total of 6 boosts to split up between the party, or however you want to handle that.
It's a lot more like the World of Darkness resources ability as
Right.
opposed to the
Yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons tedious accounting.
Right. And then in addition to that, if you want to incorporate your character's wealth into your concept, like that you come from a wealthy merchant family or a noble family, then you just put that as one of your aspects, and that will give you an additional boost. It kind of talks about in there. So you can have that be part of your backstory as well. Those are mostly character things, but there is a section in it. I mentioned there are a lot of Freeport-specific monsters, but before that, there's a section about creating monsters to put in there on your own. So it gives you some guidelines for how to do that in terms of Fate and the way Fate works. So even if you're not a big fan of the actual Freeport as a city or a setting, there's a lot of really good resources in here to be able to run your D&D game as a Fate game for a little more narrative focus, or if you just want to try something different than good old-fashioned D&D and you don't want to go the OSR route. All right, after that is the Denizens of Freeport, which is just a boatload of NPCs that are very well fleshed out and developed, of all different sort. Humans, I almost said metahuman, humans and the other, fantasy races, good guys, bad guys, men, women, it runs the gambit, sorcerers, clerics, fighters, thieves, rogues, scoundrels, the whole bit. So there is a good amount in here. And even if you don't have your game set in Freeport, you could very easily take any of these NPCs and drop them into your game because, like I said, they are all very well developed. They have a few of your classic, generic thug, copper, that kind of stuff.
Are there any sorts of pre-made adventures in this? I know
Yes.
Fate usually is not that big on that.
So
but...
in the back, there is a Fate of Freeport adventure, Fury in the Freeport. Now, if we're being completely honest, we haven't actually ran this adventure before, but I can say I've ran a fair amount of pre-made adventures, and this one looks to be put together pretty well. It looks like it would be a fun game to play, but like I said, we don't generally use Freeport as one of our settings, so I just never ran it. Although you could very easily drop this into any port city that has pirates and scoundrels, which I think if you have a port city, by definition, you have to have
Pirates and Scoundrels.
Exactly. So this would be very easy to drop into any game that you wanted, and your players could have a good time with it. And it's well laid out. It's got cool twists and turns, good NPCs, good monsters. It's a good little game to run. So that's the long and short of Fate of Freeport. Is there anything else that you have to say specifically about the book or the setting?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Okay, I don't think we didn't really talk about Freeport much at all, and I'm not an expert on Freeport, but just to give you a quick synopsis of what it is, Green Ronin put it out as a D20 game originally, I think in the early 2000s, and it came out and they had loads of success with it, and it was kind of one of their default settings. So it's a fantasy city with all kinds of different races that we mentioned at the character creation portion of this, and there's lots of piracy and cults and scoundrels and corruption and all that kind of stuff, which is why all those are all mechanics that exist in the game. And it's very well developed. There's a whole lot more to it that you could dig into in terms of detail in the setting, if that's what you're into, and all of it would be compatible with this. You could get the other books that they've already put out and use them as source material and still run them in a Fate game, and it would work just fine. And I find that if you have to convert characters or monsters or NPCs from one game into another, to take something into Fate is very easy, because if it has a background section, you read that and you say, these are the important sentences, these are my aspects, I'm done, right? And then if you look at their stats, if they have strength, dex, con, just look at how they are from highest to lowest in terms of what their numerical rating is, and then you would apply that to whether they have a +3 or a -1, right?
Yep.
And just go straight down the line. So it's very simple, very straightforward. You could convert any of that to this game to run it as a Fate game very easily. So
It's actually, I think, even easier for this particular thing, because when you're looking at your classic D20 character sheets, you've got your race, alignment, and class right there at the top, and that's basically your high concept sentence.
done. Yeah. Yeah. And if you wanted to add a couple adjectives in there to embellish it a little and give it a little more detail, go right ahead. And then all the other aspects or trouble and all that stuff would come just from the background paragraphs.
Right.
And it's basically done right there for you. So we've talked about the setting in the system and what makes Fate of Freeport. So what do you think it is that Fate of Freeport does well?
I think it does an excellent job of taking the Fate system and making it easy to use for a classic D20 style game.
Right on. So you think it captures the D&D feel?
Yes, I do.
Like how so? Like what about it captures the D&D feel?
Well, changing the core skill set, adding magic and equipment, and that's basically for me the D&D feel. Like you've got all of your charisma, wisdom, strength, dex, whatever, and it's a little bit more combat focused than what I feel like Fate would normally be.
Right. I agree. I kind of feel like when we sat down and I ran this, that I don't know if it's because the way that I approached the game maybe made it easier for me to get into in terms of a D&D mindset, but when I was sitting there and we're doing things, I'm like, all right, go ahead and make a strength check for me, make a strength roll for me. It just put me in that mindset that much easier. Mm-hmm. And we use this, if I remember right, to run a Dragonlance game essentially, and I really enjoyed it because I was like right into it. I didn't have all of the number crunching that I had to do with a D20 style game, but we were right into this Fate, or we were right into that Dragonlance game without all the synergy bonuses and all that kind of stuff, right?
Well, it's so much simpler, and just the Fate system in general sets up the feel of the party. Like you're not just these random people that meet in an inn and you flush out how you all know each other as you go. Like, you're intermingled through your aspects.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so there's already a cohesive reason for your party to be together and interacting. So the story is a little less clunky than sometimes it is when you just sit down and all you've considered is your skills and not any of your personal traits.
Right. Well, I agree. That's probably the thing that it does the best is that it eliminates the artificial scene where everybody meets for the first time at the inn to go off on the adventure. Hooray!
I mean, I'm not saying don't do that.
I am.
But
I am saying don't do that. It's entirely artificial. It doesn't make any sense, and it's kind of a waste of time. And I've found that...
Well, you can start your story wherever you like.
Right. Okay. That, yes. But
if your characters already know each other, then it doesn't have that lame, clunky, artificial feeling.
And then it builds a history into it. And I think that is what I like. One of the things I like about this the most is that it gets you, once you have the characters made, and that creation portion can take a little longer maybe, but what you lose in time in doing those aspects and that phase trio thing that they talk about in Fate, you gain back in all the other stuff that you don't have to do, like spending skill points and buying all loads of equipment and all that stuff. It's much, much easier. See, what you lose in one spot, you gain in another. But what you're spending your time on will pay dividends in terms of story and getting the ball moving faster. So that, I think, is what this game does best, is that it maybe forces is the wrong word, but it kind of already sets you up to do that, to create a better, deeper background and story for your characters to get the role-playing happening faster, as opposed to this strange, artificial, clunky thing where the first few adventures are setting up the relationships along an adventure as opposed to already having that built.
Right. I also like that you still have all of the combat without getting bogged down in the system to where it's taking you an hour to mow down all the goblins that you know you're going to inevitably kill anyway.
Right.
Because now, instead of counting out your 5x5 squares, your combat is set up in zones. So zone 1, 2, and 3. You're either in in one of those 3 places. You know you can move over to this zone and you can slay however many goblins happen to be in this zone. If it's 20 of them, then so be it. And you're just really like slicing that down and doing much more of it more quickly. Well.
And when we sat down and did this, we had the 3 zones laid out, but we actually busted out miniatures and some Dragonlock terrain that I had, and we put it together because they were in sewers. And while we weren't counting 5-foot squares, you still had the visual representation with the minis and the terrain.
Yeah, and I definitely
broken up into zones.
I encourage people to do that because you were very resistant to it at first. You're like, no, you can't do minis with this game. It's just because you're not counting it out in 5x5 squares. It doesn't matter. Draw an arbitrary line. This is zone 1 and this is zone 2. And it adds a certain something, you know. I love the miniatures.
I was 100% wrong there, and I thought it added a lot to it, and it did make it feel more like D&D for me when we did that. So I would recommend anyone that is running more of a dungeon crawl style game with Fate to do that, because it worked really well. It did the job. Everybody's excited to see the minis out, and they're trying to figure, how we go here. And I had different aspects for different zones because you were in a sewer. So if you fell in the water, then the water pushed you a zone this way. It was a lot of fun. It added a depth and a tactical element to combat and Fate that we hadn't ever really had before. Right on. Is there anything else that you think this game does well, specifically?
No, well, that hit the highlights for me.
I agree. I think it hits all the right buttons for me for a D&D style game with the stats. Making the equipment a little more important is fun, so that you just don't have sword X as opposed to, there's a little bit of difference there depending on if you have a dagger versus a longsword versus a greatsword. There's enough difference to make it flavorful in a narrative way, but also in a mechanical way, which is cool. So, right on. So who do you think this game is for?
Anyone who wants to play D&D that is much more manageable. This is less prep. There's less books open in front of you. It's less hassle and headache, less mathematical equations, less to keep track of in general. It is less where it counts and more, I don't know, I think I said that backwards. It's more where it counts and less where it doesn't.
I agree with most of what you're saying. I think that it definitely is for people that want to be able to play D&D without all the crunch to it. But I'm not sure that I agree with you when you say it is less work in terms of planning, because I think that depends on the style of game you're going to run. if you're going to run more of a free form style game, I don't think it's any more or less planning in the D&D sense than it is in a Fate sense. Maybe except for whipping up creatures real quick because the stats in D&D are much more involved than they are in a Fate game. That piece of it, yes, but in terms of story, I think it's kind of depends on what kind of game master you are. So, but I do think it is perfect for someone who is tired of being bogged down in a system, but still wants to play a fantasy RPG. Are there any ways that you think this game falls short, or ways that things that it doesn't do well?
Not really for me, no. I kind of wish that Lee was here because I feel like he would have a lot more criticism for this, because he is somebody who really enjoys tedious character creation and crunching the numbers and system. And Greg's the same way. He really enjoys system, and this is Fate, so it is very system light.
Right.
And you lose a lot of that, and some people really enjoy that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I will say, to mention Lee's point, I know when we talked about this before, he was a little frustrated initially with the magic system, but as it turns out, it's because we were doing it wrong. Because I had one Fate game going and then decided to try and merge it into this Fate of Freeport thing. So we had to kind of do some work. And the first game, he was a little frustrated. And then when I fully read everything and merged it all the way in and it all made sense, it worked a whole lot better. It does take a little bit to kind of get used to because in terms of the way you pick your spells and stuff, if you're accustomed to a D&D style game, it does take a little bit of acclimation to do that.
I guess it probably does seem like you're getting less.
Yeah.
If you're playing a magic person. Mm-hmm. But I've always avoided the wizard class because there is much too much. Right. So this is the only way I would play a wizard at all.
Right. So I think I might actually, as I sit here and think about it, I think I might agree with Lee in some ways in that if you play a spellcaster, you are getting less spells in a way, but I'm not sure if that is a flaw or a feature in the same way that with some of the old school Renaissance games like Lamentations, there's just much less spells to choose from, and they're much more streamlined and specialized. So I guess if you're holding it side by side to a classic D20, D&D, Pathfinder style thing, then yeah, that is going to be a big difference for you. But there's also nothing to stop you from making your own spells. It's pretty easy to do. So I guess it's easily fixable that way. But if you're looking for it straight out the box, like straight out the book, it is kind of limiting, I guess, that way. So that could be a way that if that is an issue for your players, it might fall short. But I think it's easily fixable.
Okay.
If you're looking for that 5-foot step, +2 bonus for flanking and all that stuff, this probably isn't for you. It's not it's crunchier and more tactical than most other Fate games are, but it is still not quite to the level of a Pathfinder 3rd edition, even 5th edition, or Hackmaster, God forbid. But I think it's approaching a happy medium between Fate and a 5th edition, maybe. So somewhere in there. Definitely not as crunchy as a D20 system or not D20. Definitely not as crunchy though as a Pathfinder or 3rd edition. So
the other thing when we're talking about who this game is not for, there is a certain group of people that appreciates the crunchy game, and there's also people that are drawn to the D20 system for deadly grittiness. So if you're someone who enjoys the classic total party kill style game, like if you're really like giving it hardcore to your players, survive this if you can, bring 4 pre-made characters to the table, then Fate is not the system. No.
If you're looking for more of an like that old school Lamentations Black Hack feel, this is not it. This is much more of a competent hero style game.
Yeah.
But
high adventure, epic, long running, your characters don't generally die.
Even swashbuckling by the cover picture on the cover there. But I think that it is
high fantasy, bold heroes.
Yeah, that's what it's designed to do. So while I don't know that you can fault something for not being something it's not designed to do, but in the same way that
hey, you're just saying who is it not for, and I'm laying it out there on the table.
No,
if that's why you come to D20, then any Fate system is probably not what you're after.
I very much agree. I very much agree with you in that it's not. It's designed to do certain things. It's designed to be heroic, like Fate is. I think that really most fantasy games are in that vein in terms of how many hit points do you get at 10th level if you're, as you go along and you're slogging through orcs and goblins and doing your thing? In the same way that it's just as easy to do that in Fate, when you have all these bonuses and stuff to boost to avoid damage and stuff. So I think it is equally as heroic as most of those games. But like you said, if you want something grittier like a Lamentations thing, it's going to be awful hard to do this with. And I think it would be easier to do that with other games. So right on. So that's pretty much it. Is there anything you want to geek out about this game?
I feel like I kind of already did. Like, I really like it. It takes all the things that I love about the classic Dungeons and Dragons game and makes it more enjoyable, easier to run, and easier to play.
I agree. If you've been listening to us for a while, you probably know that I've been burnt out on fantasy games for quite a while now. And this is one of the first ones that kind of started to turn me around about that. And I really enjoy, I haven't played in it, but I've ran it several sessions and I really had a good time with it. It was fun. There's always this little bit of anxiety when you're running a D&D game about just like accidentally killing players because the dice just go poorly on someone's side and then great on my end. But in Fate, I know that's almost never going to happen. You're not just accidentally going to, roll 3 20s in a row and somebody's head falls off. It just doesn't work that way.
I feel a little bad about the Freeport thing, though, and you may cut all this out because it's not relevant to the Fate of Freeport review, but I'm kind of like, if you're going to play high adventure swashbuckling, why would you play anything that's not 7th Sea? So I love this for D&D.
Right. But I think that's just because we're big 7th Sea fans.
Because it's awesome.
It is, but 7th Sea isn't high fantasy, though.
Pirate adventures are high fantasy.
I don't know. I don't think so. High adventure, yes, but high fantasy, no.
Okay.
Well, I mean, think about...
Okay, so there's no dragons and wizards, but there's sorcerers and krakens. How is that any less high fantasy?
But, so, think about, like, all the stuff that Gandalf does, right? Which is, that's high fantasy, right? And all the magic that exists in Lord of the Rings, okay?
He comes back from the dead. That's just religion. That's not even fantasy.
But it's still, there's loads of magic that happens with the elves and all this other stuff. And the magic is much more present in the world as opposed to in swashbuckling and those high adventure things. A lot of them have a piece of that because I think the one that you immediately go to, I think for a lot of it is Pirates of the Caribbean. And there's curses and that kind of stuff in there, but there's not the same style of arcane magic where people are slinging fireballs and running around doing that stuff. And while there might be a sea monster, that's the sea monster in that movie, as opposed to monsters amok everywhere.
Well, I mean, there's kind of monsters amok everywhere in the first one because they're all cursed and
right. Well, yeah, but
animated skeleton people.
Right. That's a.
And then the
twist,
second one, there's Calypso and an entire ship full of sea people.
I think that as that series goes along, it starts to involve more and more of the fantastical. But most swashbuckling stuff doesn't involve magic outside of curses on your deathbed and strange deserted islands. Yeah, the black spot or witchcraft style stuff.
Okay, fine. So, high adventure fantasy.
There you go.
But not high fantasy, wherever your distinction there lies.
Pretty big tangent, but this has reinvigorated me, at least for fantasy gaming, and I really think that if I'm going to run a fantasy game, it is either going to be Lamentations or it's going to be Fate of Freeport. I really feel like that's where I fall in terms of my fantasy gaming now. If I want something gritty and dangerous that tests players, Lamentations. If I want something that is high adventure and story focused and still captures that D&D feel to me, Fate of Freeport.
I agree.
Right on. So, Fate of Freeport from Green Ronin and Evil Hat. We like this game?
Yes.
Right on. Fate of Freeport. Check it out. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can find us at justonemorefix.com and follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.